On May 29, 2026, the United States Fifth Fleet issued a navigational warning covering a specific corridor of international waters in the Persian Gulf. The language was routine. The coordinates were not. Those coordinates placed the warning zone directly over the primary tanker transit lane that carries approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz. Hold on to that, because within 24 hours, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Naval Force conducted what they described as a defensive exercise in the same general area, involving fast attack craft, submarine movements, and what Iranian state media called swarm drone deployment from maritime platforms. Two things. Same waters. Same 24-hour window. The Fifth Fleet's navigational warning assumed those waters were, functionally, under American deterrence control. Iran's exercise demonstrated in real time that the assumption was wrong. And today, I am going to show you that this was not a one-off demonstration. It was Iran deliberately exposing the most dangerous assumption in American strategic thinking, and doing it in the most visible way possible. Right now, every major outlet is treating this as a naval standoff story. Ships, distances, warnings, responses. That is the wrong frame. The right question is this: what precisely is the assumption Iran is exposing? Why is it so dangerous? And why has Washington apparently not yet understood what is being shown to it? In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to answer all three parts of that question. And the answer is going to require us to think about something that sounds almost philosophical, but is actually the most practical, strategic question there is. What happens when a deterrence posture is built on an assumption that your adversary has spent 20 years quietly invalidating? The framework I want to use today is what I call the assumption exposure doctrine. Let me explain it simply. Every military deterrence posture is built on a set of foundational assumptions about what your adversary can and cannot do, will and will not do, and how quickly they can transition from one state to another. These assumptions are not guesses. They are the product of years of intelligence collection, wargaming, and operational planning. They become embedded in doctrine. They shape force structure. They determine where you station assets and how quickly you can respond to a threat. The problem, and this is the problem Iran has identified and is now exploiting, is that assumptions, once embedded in doctrine, become nearly invisible. They stop being treated as assumptions and start being treated as facts. And an adversary that can identify your embedded assumptions and then demonstrate in controlled increments that those assumptions are false can effectively dismantle your deterrence posture without ever firing a shot in anger. The historical anchor here is Vietnam, not the grand strategic failure, the specific tactical failure that Robert McNamara later documented in his memoir In Retrospect. American military planning in Vietnam was built on the assumption that superior firepower applied at sufficient scale would degrade enemy fighting capacity to the point of strategic collapse. This assumption was embedded so deeply in American doctrine that when the evidence began to accumulate that it was wrong. Jiang Xueqin na sandimadakar datsun adarsan. Enemy's forces were absorbing firepower at rates that would have broken any force the planning models knew. The response was not to question the assumption. The response was to apply more firepower. The assumption protected itself from the evidence that refuted it. Iran has studied McNamara's failure with what I can only describe as scholarly intensity. It has identified the equivalent embedded assumptions in American military doctrine for the Gulf theater, and it is demonstrating their falsity carefully, incrementally, in conditions that do not require Washington to formally acknowledge that the demonstration is happening. Now let me give you the 5 core assumptions Iran has been exposing, with specific documented evidence for each. Number 1, the assumption of escalation dominance. American strategic doctrine in the Gulf has long operated on the assumption that in any conflict with Iran, the United States possesses escalation dominance, the ability to escalate more effectively than Iran at every rung of the ladder, from naval harassment all the way up to regime-threatening strikes. The October 2024 Iranian missile barrage challenged this assumption directly. Iran demonstrated it could launch 200 ballistic missiles simultaneously. The interception rate contested, as I noted in an earlier episode, was significant but not complete. An escalation dominance posture that cannot guarantee complete intercept of a 200 missile salvo is not escalation dominance. It is escalation competition. And competition is a fundamentally different strategic equation. Number two, the assumption of proxy controllability. American deterrence doctrine assumed that Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Houthi forces in Yemen, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, were directed by Tehran and would stand down if Tehran were pressured effectively. The events of 2024 and 2025 have exposed this assumption as outdated. Houthi forces in Yemen have continued Red Sea shipping disruption operations for months at a time without evidence of a direct Iranian operational control signal driving each individual attack. The Mosaic defense, the decentralized 31-province command structure, applies to the proxy network as well. You cannot switch it off by pressuring the center because the center is not the switch. Think of it this way. If someone punches you in the face, you don't go looking for the hand. You go looking for the brain. But what if the hand can punch without waiting for the brain? What if the proxy network has, over years of operational experience, developed autonomous operational logic that persists even without active direction from Tehran? That is not a hypothesis. That is what the pattern of 2024 and 2025 attacks demonstrates. Number three, the assumption of economic coercion effectiveness. The United States has applied extraordinary economic pressure to Iran through sanctions. The assumption embedded in this pressure campaign is that economic pain at sufficient scale produces political capitulation or an ethics behavioral modification. Iran has spent 20 years building an economy that is structurally adapted to function under sanction pressure. According to the International Monetary Fund's 2025 Article 4 consultation on Iran, the Iranian economy contracted in 2019 and 2020 under maximum pressure sanctions, but returned to growth in 2021 and has maintained positive GDP growth since, despite the maintenance of those sanctions. An economy that absorbs maximum pressure and continues to grow has not been broken by economic coercion. It has been inoculated against it, okay? The assumption that economic pressure produces the desired political outcome has been empirically refuted by 2 decades of data. But the assumption remains embedded in policy. Number four, the assumption of regional partner reliability. American strategy in the Gulf is premised on the reliability of regional partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, as platforms, hosts, and operational enablers. The Abraham Accords represented the high watermark of this assumption, a framework in which Arab states were aligning with Israel and, by extension, with American strategic goals in the region. But since the October 2024 escalation, the Gulf states have been conducting simultaneous back-channel engagements with Iran. The UAE restored its ambassador to Tehran in 2023. Saudi Arabia negotiated a direct diplomatic normalization with Iran, brokered by China in 2023. These are documented facts. The assumption of reliable regional partner alignment with American strategic preferences in a conflict with Iran is not a reliable assumption. And the American force posture in the Gulf bases, logistics chains, pre-positioned equipment is built on that assumption holding. Number five, the assumption of information dominance. American military doctrine assumes that in any Gulf conflict, the United States will have information superiority, that it will know more about Iranian positions, capabilities, and intentions than Iran knows about American positions, capabilities, and intentions. The shadow weapons network I discussed in a previous analysis challenges this assumption from the Iranian side. Iran has built capacity it did not believe could be fully tracked, but Iran has also been actively investing in what its military calls electronic warfare capabilities. Jamming, spoofing, and electromagnetic interference systems designed to degrade American sensors, communications, and navigation in the Gulf theater. According to a 2025 report by the Congressional Research Service on Iranian military modernization, Iran has acquired and domestically developed electronic warfare systems that are assessed as capable of disrupting GPS signals and communications links in localized areas. Information dominance that can be locally disrupted is not dominance. It is advantage. And advantage can be contested. Now let me steelman the counter-argument. The strongest case against my framework is this. Iran is exposing these assumptions precisely because it cannot actually exploit them in a direct conflict. Demonstrating that your adversary's assumptions are wrong is not the same as winning a war. The United States military, even with imperfect assumptions, retains overwhelming conventional superiority. A conflict with Iran that went to full conventional warfare would result in catastrophic Iranian losses, regardless of these assumption failures. Under this reading, Iran's assumption exposure strategy is strategic theater. It affects the diplomatic environment and the deterrence calculus at the margins, but it does not alter the fundamental military balance. This is a serious argument, but here is what that argument cannot explain. It cannot explain why, if the assumption failures are strategically irrelevant, the United States has not conducted a direct military operation against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, despite years of stated concern about Iranian nuclear ambitions. The assumption failures are not irrelevant to war planning. They are precisely what makes the operational risk of a direct conflict high enough that the political cost of not acting keeps being judged lower than the operational risk of acting. The exposed assumptions are the reason the deterrence by threat posture has not converted into deterrence by action. That is not irrelevant. That is the entire game. Let me bring this together. The assumption exposure doctrine tells us that Iran's strategic behavior over the past decade has been, at its core, a systematic campaign to identify and demonstrate the falsity of the foundational assumptions of American Gulf deterrence, not to defeat the United States in a direct conflict, but to make the political leadership in Washington perpetually uncertain about whether a direct conflict would unfold according to plan. Uncertainty is enough. A president who is not certain that a strike will achieve its objectives without triggering a broader conflict that cannot be contained is a president who does not authorize the strike. Iran does not need to win a war. Iran needs only to make the risk calculation of starting one look worse than the status quo. And the exposure of 5 foundational assumptions: escalation dominance, proxy controllability, economic coercion effectiveness, regional partner reliability, and information dominance makes that risk calculation worse. The patient giant. Again, China's People's Liberation Army has been studying every Iranian assumption exposure demonstration with what multiple American defense analysts, including those at the RAND Corporation, have described as intense operational interest. The lessons Iran is teaching about how to contest American assumptions in a specific theater are lessons that translate with modification to the Pacific. The cost ratios are different. The geography is different. But the fundamental strategic logic identify your adversary's embedded assumptions and demonstrate their falsity before the conflict begins is entirely portable. China is not a passive observer of what is happening in the Gulf. China is enrolled in a master class. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch American naval positioning in the Gulf. If the Fifth Fleet moves additional assets into the Strait of Hormuz transit corridor following the Iranian exercise, that would indicate Washington is trying to reassert the assumption of escalation dominance through visible presence. If the posture holds static, it may indicate something more complicated. An internal debate about whether reasserting presence validates or inflames the Iranian demonstration. Second, watch for any statements from the Joint Chiefs or CENTCOM about operational readiness in the Gulf theater. Changes in language about readiness posture or deterrent sufficiency would be unusually candid signals. Third, watch Israeli military communications about independent strike planning. If Israel believes American deterrence assumptions have been sufficiently eroded that Washington will not act, Israel may be recalculating whether it needs to act independently. Israeli military communication signals preceding such a recalculation have historically included increased exercise activity and public statements about independent capability. Your homework, read Robert McNamara's In Retrospect, specifically Chapter 6 through 9, and then read the Congressional Research Service's 2025 report on Iranian military modernization. Put those two documents next to each other and ask yourself, are the assumption failures McNamara describes in Vietnam structurally similar to the assumption failures the CRS is documenting in the Gulf? If you think the comparison is wrong, tell me exactly why in the comments. I want that pushback. I want to be shown where the analogy breaks down. And the question I leave you with? When a deterrence architecture is built on assumptions that your adversary has spent 2 decades systematically invalidating, and when the invalidation is happening in plain sight, in international waters, in public exercises, in documented intelligence assessments, beach I know or nine. And at winoing storm, one prinor arnsom points arnang time bis this anchon they say architecture stop being deterrence and start being theater. And if deterrence becomes theater, who is the audience and what are they being distracted from? I will see you in the next one.